Hi, this is Nathan Harrison for FindRemodel.com. The first thing you want to know about this is how to pronounce it. It's Cupola, like Cupid, as in Valentine's Day Cupid. Cupola. When I set out to understand the history and the meaning of the cupola, what I found was confusing and seemingly contradictory definitions. Let me give you some examples. Cupola, a light structure on a dome or roof serving as a belfry, that's a bell tower, a lantern, which I'll tell you about later, or a belvedere, a place to see a particular view off in the distance. The second definition for cupola being a dome, especially one covering a circular or polygonal area. And then another definition being any of various dome-like structures. Another cupola definition from a dictionary, the Penguin Dictionary of Architecture, says it's a dome, especially a small dome on a circular or polygonal base crowning a roof or turret. Now, I had gone to investigate this because I'm interested in the cupola, and this is something very common here in America, but this definition doesn't make sense at all for practically all of the cupolas I'm familiar with. What I'm familiar with is a small structure on the peak of a roof. So it's this jumble of facts without any real sense in them. And I spent most of today trying to understand it, and I believe I've got it packaged in a fairly tight package for you. My first inclination was to look for the most plausible historical theory of how this would have originated. And here was my theory. This feature goes back to houses that needed a lookout point. Now we know that this word cupola is of Italian origin. What do we know about Italy? Well, if you read Machiavelli's letter to the prince, who is unnamed in the letter, but this famous letter by Machiavelli, which was written around 1500, what you discover is that Italy had lived through centuries of incessant warfare and foreign occupation. So it's a militarized society to some degree, where security is a big issue. If you think about the idea of houses needing a lookout and contrast that with the idea of castles with stone towers, it leads you to the inference that a cupola may essentially be a budget lookout point for the common man, or at least someone who doesn't have the money to build a stone tower. And I think one other observation that lends credence to this view that this is how the cupola originated is that most architectural features have their roots in some kind of security arrangement. In the medieval world from which most of our modern architecture derives, they were fairly preoccupied with security. So this was my original thought, that this concept comes from the idea of a lookout point, which is very practical, and that everything else that grew up around it was, of course, the decorative and the migration of the idea to more and more expensive applications like domes on cathedrals. But there's a big problem with this theory. The word cupola is kind of what it sounds like. It's implying a cup. It's a reference to the dome shape. In fact, the most strict architectural definitions of cupola simply mean a dome. And so it couldn't be that this concept got started as a budget lookout when people were using domes. A dome is a difficult structure to build. It's showy. It's not pragmatic. So this is a clear indication that this concept began with cathedrals or some kind of large decorative showy structure. Support for this is that we know that domes were being built in Europe as early as the 11th century, and they were replicas or seem to have been carried over from the Islamic world, where they were built back into the nearly to the time of Christ. Of course, there was no Islam then, but the domes were being built in North Africa and the Middle East. So first the domes came, and then I sort of speculate that at some point to the dome was added a lookout place. And it was probably just a decorative effect at first, but I think someone picked up on this as a good element to add to a home to give it this lookout ability. And from there the concept migrated toward more practical application of this idea of a cupola, to the point that now it's acceptable to include other shapes. Square, rectangle, and octagonal are what you mainly find now for cupolas. So unless you're thinking of putting a dome on top of your house, you have to admit that what you're going to put up could only loosely be called a cupola. And that's okay. Words migrate over time. So how would we define a cupola today? Well, it could be a louvered vent or a window, which would both be consistent with this idea of a lookout. If the cupola is designed in such a way that it can give light to the floor of the main structure below it, it would be considered a lantern. Now, something similar to a cupola that I don't think should be confused with it is a turret, which is a small tower that projects from the wall of a building. The key being here that a turret would be at the outside of the building, whereas the cupola tends to be at the center of either the entire structure or a major portion of the structure. I think we can clearly say that it's different from a dormer, which projects from a slope of the roof. I don't think that we can say definitively that it's different from a bell tower, even if the bell tower doesn't have a dome on it. And I don't think that it would be fair to say that this is not a cupola because of its large size. As some definitions I've seen have said that the structure should be small, but really the original cupolas were actually quite large, and if we're going to let other square and rectangular cupolas into our definition, then I think we should allow something like this in as well.